welcome to my channel, The Mysterious One. Here we uncover chilling crimes, unsolved mysteries, and eerie encounters that will keep you questioning what's real. Let's dive into today's story. Today we will be talking about the Harpe Brothers, also known as America's first serial killers. Micajah, Big Harpe, Wiley, Little Harpe, possibly cousins rather than brothers, but they lived and killed together as if they were. Both born in North Carolina before the American Revolution, raised during violent frontier times, there were raids and lawlessness was very common. Some accounts suggest that they supported the British during the Revolutionary War, engaging in raiding. After the war, they became notorious outlaws, preying on settlers moving west. Their criminal activity mainly was active between the years of 1797 and 1804, mainly in Kentucky, Tennessee, Illinois, and Mississippi territories. Unlike later serial killers with specific victim types, the Harpe Brothers' murders were men, women, children, even infants, travelers, farmers, and sometimes entire families. The motive seemed to be sheer brutality rather than profit or revenge. In 1797, their first widely known murders took place near Knoxville, Tennessee, including the killing of a man named Johnson. It wasn't until 1799 where the murder of a man named Thomas Langford, whose body was found near a river stuffed with stones. Infamously, Big Harpe killed his own infant child, smashing it against a tree because it cried and annoyed him. Their estimate victim count ranges from 20 to 40 plus people. In 1799, Big Harpe was tracked down by a posse after murdering a woman named Mrs. Stagel, shot and captured and beheaded near Henderson, Kentucky. His head was displayed on a stake as a warning to others, but Little Harpe continued his killing spree. And it wasn't until 1804 where he was captured and executed in Mississippi. His head was also displayed as a warning to others. Their legacy will always be known as America's first serial killers, and sometimes America's frontier serial killers. Their violence shocked frontier communities, which were already accustomed to danger. Their story is preserved in folklore, criminal history, and early American literature. Locations where they killed is still marked in Kentucky with references to Harp's Head Road and similar names. So my first question would be, how do the Harpe brothers differ from modern day serial killers in terms of motives or victim selection? Because the Harpe brothers are often compared to modern day serial killers, but I noticed there are some key differences in both motive and victim selection, which make them kind of unique, especially for the time that it happened. Like, for instance, let's start with motive. The Harpe brothers' primary motive appears to have been pure violence and cruelty. They didn't kill for profit, sexual gratification, or even revenge. Their murders often lacked planning or purpose. Many were random It seems as though that they took pleasure in fear, suffering, and dominance over others. While modern day serial killers tend to have more of a psychological complex motives, often falling into categories like lust, power, control, mission based, financial gain. Um, to call out a few, like Ted Bundy, killed for lust. John Wayne Gacy, killed for power and control. Mission based, such as targeting a specific group. Or H. Holmes, which many believe to be the first American killer, killed for financial gain. Many kill in secret, often trying to evade detection or long periods of time. And then there's getting into the victim selection. The Harpe brothers did not discriminate at all. Their victims included men, women, children, infants, strangers, travelers, and even acquaintances. One of them actually, like I stated, killed their own child to silence it from crying. They attacked whoever was available, which is kind of crazy when you think about it, especially isolated families or travelers. Whereas, on the other hand, modern day killers typically have a type, many focused on specific ages, groups, genders, characteristics, often stalked or planned their attacks in advance, which seemed more calculated as time went on. Um, Crimes were usually more mythical with patterns that can be profiled by law enforcement. Their psychological profile, the Harpe brothers were considered spree killers by some due to rapid public nature of their killings, more opportunistic than mythical. Their behavior suggests sociopath, sadism, but without the calculated precision seen in modern day profiles. Like, for instance, modern day serial killers often led double lives, hiding in plain sight, usually follow patterns that forensic psychologists can profile. Somehow, signs of obsessive compulsive behavior. But maybe sometimes historical context matters, though. Like, for instance, the Harpe brothers operated in early American frontier in the late 1700s, a lawless, violent, and unpolicy region. Their killings were shocking for the time, but also harder to track due to a lack of centralized law enforcement. Whereas modern day killers operate in more controlled societies with surveillance, media coverage, and forensic science, which shapes how they act. And the more I do a deep dive on their story, and I have to ask myself, why did their brutality and their crimes stand out in such a time where violent acts were a thing? They were living in such a violent frontier era. Why did what they were doing seemed more brutal than what was going on around that time? You know, like when you think about modern day serial killers, normally they're happening in neighborhoods where a lot of crime isn't taking place, or the crime doesn't make sense because it's, you know, happening senselessly, and it's happening in either patterns or, um, maybe bodies are just showing up in lakes or rivers and cars and things like that. And it kind of doesn't make sense in the 21st century to commit such acts. But if you were living in a time where it was normal, why did they stand out to become America's first serial killers? Weren't everyone killing in that era? Weren't senseless acts of killing, just not having a motive for killing anyone, actually, wouldn't that make sense to do it and not get questioned for it, or not, become a target for something that everyone else is doing as well? Then I also posed the question, once they were captured and murdered or executed for their crimes, their heads were put on display as a warning to others. So, was this a start of maybe cracking down on certain crimes, or was just was it just because their crime was senseless and they were just killing just because? Was that then the turning point in America where you needed a reason to murder or execute someone, when there's never a reason? But according to them back then, did you need a valid reason to murder someone? It kind of opens the door to discussing both mindsets of early American justice and the culture of fear and control in frontier society. Like, the more I think about it, the whole displaying their head thing, was it effective deterrent or more of a symbolic act? If you ask me personally, it was more likely symbolic than effective. But in frontier justice, symbolism was more powerful back then. Like, for instance, frontier communities lacked strong law enforcement, prison systems, so publicly displaying the brother's head and several other heads on stakes along the road served as a message. This is what happens to murderers here. This is what we do. This is what will happen to you. So it was more of like a scare tactic, and it kind of restored a sense of order and control in a place where justice often fell out of reach. And that leads me to my next question. Like, what does their story reveal about crime and punishment in early America? Like, how important is it for us to understand how the Harpe Brothers stories fit into a larger picture of American history? The history of the Harpe Brothers highlight key realities about law, justice, and morality in early America, especially in frontier regions during the late 1700s and the early 1800s. Like, it kind of reveals a justice system that was often decentralized, community driven, and deeply shaped by survival and fear. Like, for me, there were 5 main takeaways from the Harpe Brothers story. 1, justice was local, swift, and often violent. 2, punishment was more symbolic as it was practical. 3, crime was defined by community morality. 4, the frontier was a breeding ground for outlaws. And finally, storytelling was a key part of justice and memory. Like, there was no organized police force or court system in many frontier areas. Justice often came through community action. Criminals were tracked, punished, and even executed on the spot with little to no trial. The Harps were hunted by citizens and killed without formal legal proceedings. Like, Big Harp was the first to have his head cut off and placed on a stake as a warning to others. That kind of public display served not just as a punishment, but a deterrent and symbol of having order restored. It reflected a form of justice that was public, performative, and deeply tied to fear and reputation. Then, when you think about it, the Harps shocked even a violent society. For them to be executed and sought after and punished the way they were in such a violent time in history. But it was because that they broke more than just laws. They violated shared moral codes. Killing women, children without motive went beyond typical outlaw behavior. Early American communities placed strong emphasis on protecting the vulnerable, and the Harps totally went against that. The Harps' disregard for protecting the vulnerable made them a unique threat. And so much so, frontier society was especially vulnerable to men like the Harps, who could move from town to town before the news or justice even caught up to them. And as time go on, I wonder, should the Harpe brothers be remembered mainly as criminals or as symbols of dangers of America's frontier past? Which is kind of a compelling and nuanced question. Because when you think about it, one that invites both historical analysts and ethical reflection. For me, the short answer is both. They were brutal criminals, but their story also reflects the larger picture and violence of early America frontier life. But let's explore both sides here. Now, on one hand, remembering them as criminals, the Harpe brothers committed horrific, sadistic murders, including women, children, and their own family. They killed not out of survival, but seemingly for cruelty and control. By modern and historic standards, they were serial killers who terrorized communities. It's important not to romanticize or excuse their violence, but on the other hand, remembering them as symbols of frontier dangers. Their story reflects deeper truths about America, especially early America: a lack of law enforcement, unsettled justice systems, vulnerable and isolated communities. They represent what can happen in a power vacuum, like when chaos, violence collide. In that sense, they are symbols of dangers of an untamed frontier, like not just individuals going rogue. And one thing, let's not forget, the Harpe brothers exposed the limits of frontier justice and morality. What early Americans feared the most wasn't just outsiders of war, but evil from within. Their stories like useful in understanding how American society evolved to demand stronger legal systems, community protection, and moral order. So for me, the Harpe Brothers should absolutely be remembered as brutal criminals, but also as cautionary figures from a lawless period in U.S. history. Their actions and the reaction to them reveal how crime, fear, and justice shaped early American identity. So, do we then see the brothers, or do we learn more from them by judging them as individuals or by seeing them as products of their environment? Because if they were a product of their environment, they looked around as the things that they were doing as normal. Studying them as individuals help us examine like what makes someone capable of such violence. Can evil be inherent, or is it always shaped by experience? This view highlights moral responsibility and personal accountability. But again, these men grew up and were born in a time where this was considered normal. And according to that time, protecting the vulnerable was a big thing for them. So women and children were supposedly off the table. Now, my question is, if women and children were excluded from their killing spree, let's say if they didn't kill not one infant or woman, children, etc., would they then still be considered serial killers? Would they have been executed the way they were? Would they have went down in history as America's first serial killers? Because then we dive into viewing them as products of their environment, understanding the frontier. The late 1700s America frontier was violent, lawless, and chaotic. The Harps grew up during the Revolutionary War, possibly exposed to brutal raids and violent acts, senseless acts. So this was considered normal. There were no consistent law enforcement systems, no psychological help therapists, no psychiatric wards. None of this existed then. And this context actually enabled their crimes and made them harder to catch and stop around that time because it was deemed normal. So why were they considered monsters among other monsters? That's my question. Because if you can say they preyed on the innocent, which will be women and children, how many innocent women and children died during the Revolutionary War or died during raids and other senseless acts? Why were the brothers targeted the way they were? Did they need a change? And at the time of the change, the brothers were just committing their crimes and they used them as a sense of change. They used them as examples to enforce the change that they wanted. That leads me to my next question. Would individuals like the Harpe brothers would have emerged in more stable society, or would they have made possible by the chaos of the frontier? It's a question that gets to the heart of nature versus nurture. debate in history, criminology. So would the short answer be individuals like the Harpe brothers may have had a violent may have had violent tendencies no matter where they lived? But how would you know if maybe they were, let's say, if they were born in today's society, would they still have had the influence to do what they did then? Because the influence that they were surrounded by were more violent and more ruthless. In today's society, that kind of behavior is looked down upon. On one hand, let's look at nature. The Harpes brothers showed signs of extreme cruelty and psychopathy. Even in 18th century standards, their pleasure in killing, lack of remorse, and willingness to murder their own family just suggest deep psychological disturbances. In any society, individuals with such traits may exist, but not all act on them. So, again, let's say if they were to live in today's society, would it be easier for them to act on it back then than it is now? Would they just, ignore their behaviors and try to live a normal day to day life? Their violent nature may have existed anywhere in history, anytime. And then on another hand, let's look at nurture, slash their environment that they grew up in. The frontier was lawless, scattered, and violent with no police, courts, no communication systems. People moved freely and anonymously. News traveled slowly. Justice was inconsistent and often vigilant led. Those conditions gave the brothers the time and space to kill repeatedly over and over again before actually being caught. So the argument, without the chaos of the frontier, they might have been stopped earlier or never had the chance to begin with. So when you combine it together, nature versus nurture, the brothers may have been born in a violent atmosphere around that time, but the violent, unstable frontier gave them the ideal environment to act unchecked. Let's say they had a more stable, structured society with law enforcement, surveillance, and social accountability. May have either deterred them, reformed them early, or captured them before they even became serial killers. Now, my final thought on the Harpe brothers: individuals like the Harpe brothers may have existed in any time period, but it's the environment that determines whether they remain hidden or stopped early, or are allowed to become legends of terror. The American frontier didn't create their evil, but it certainly gave them room to grow. The Harpe brothers were more than just violent criminals. They were a product of a time where lawless isolation and survival defined daily life. Their story focuses us to confront the darkest corners of both human nature and American history. While their brutality was uniquely horrifying, it also reflected the dangers of a society with no structure to contain violence or protect the vulnerable. In the end, the Harpe brothers should be remembered not only as early examples of serial killers, but as a stark warning of what can happen when justice breaks down. Fear, rules, and cruelty goes unchecked. Their legacy is a chilling reminder that civilization is only ever as strong as the laws and values that holds it together. As we reflect on their legacy, we're left with an important reminder. Even in the most rugged corners of history, there were lines that couldn't be crossed, and when they were, the consequences echoed through time. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And please turn on your post notifications so you can get notified every time I post. This has been The Mysterious One. Another mystery awaits. Will you be there to uncover it? I'll see you in the dark.